When you are faced with d4, if you are looking for a solid, positionally sound response, you'll be hard-pressed to find a more respected and reliable system than the Queen's Gambit declined. We reach this classical opening after the moves d4, taking space in the center, and preparing e4. Black can discourage this plan by playing d5, taking a fair share of the center and controlling e4. White's most ambitious and popular option is to turn the game into the Queen's Gambit with c4. White increases pressure against Black's center. If Black plays d takes c4, this turns the game into the Queen's Gambit accepted, the subject of another video. In that variation, Black needs to be well prepared to justify allowing White to grab more space in the center with e4. Instead of capturing the pawn, Black needs to decide how to respond to White's threat of c takes d5, trading a flank or non-center pawn for Black's central d5 pawn. If this pawn falls, then White will take over the center with e4. This means that Black should add support to this important pawn with either c6, leading to the Slav or semi-Slav defenses, or else turn the game into the Queen's Gambit declined by playing e6. This move reinforces the center, preparing to respond to c takes d5 with e takes d5, so Black is able to maintain a strong central presence. The drawback of this solid move is that it restricts the light-squared bishop, so it will be important to find a good role for this piece. We can see the battle over the d5 square intensify after the natural moves knight c3, centralizing the knight and adding pressure against the d5 pawn. Black can respond in kind with knight f6, developing and reinforcing the central stronghold on d5. One popular option for White is to play c takes d5, known as the exchange variation, which we'll discuss in another video. The most classical response for White is to rapidly develop with bishop g5, pinning the f6 knight to the queen, which applies indirect pressure to the d5 pawn. White has created the positional threat of bishop takes f6, damaging Black's pawn structure after g takes f6. If Black responds with queen takes f6, this actually loses a pawn after c takes d5. With this in mind, Black typically responds with bishop e7, unpinning the knight and preparing to castle. White can continue to develop with knight f3, or likely transpose to the same position after first playing e3, supporting the center and opening up a diagonal for the light-squared bishop. We are going to examine two of Black's most popular defenses in this classical Queen's Gambit declined position. In both of these opening variations, Black will include the move h6, either immediately or after castling the king to safety. White continues to develop and support the center with knight f3. Black has a variety of choices in this position, but in order to reach the mainline defenses, Black needs to play h6, immediately putting the question to the bishop. Although it's generally not a good idea to move pawns in front of your king too early, this is a useful strategic move, forcing White to declare the bishop's intentions. Since the pawn is no longer on h7, it does not rely on the defense of the f6 knight, which may be traded or will seek activity on another square. This is especially important if White decides to create a queen-bishop battery on the b1 to h7 diagonal. In response to h6, White's most popular response is to maintain the tension with bishop h4. But White may also consider playing bishop takes f6, surrendering the bishop pair after bishop takes f6. White can calmly continue to develop with a move such as rook c1, adding pressure down the c-file and likely castling kingside. If White is feeling aggressive, then queen c2, followed by castling queenside is another option to consider. Depending on the position, Black may play for a quick c5 break, trying to activate the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal. By removing the f6 knight, the d5 pawn has less protection, so another plan is to solidify the center with c6, which then allows knight d7. opening up the possibility of preparing an e5 break, often with the sequence d takes c4, followed by e5. This sideline is an interesting option with plenty of play for both sides. In response to h6, White's typical response is to maintain the tension with bishop h4. We have now reached the traditional main line of the Queen's Gambit declined, in which Black has two popular choices. One idea is to offer an exchange of minor pieces with knight e4, known as the Lasker defense. The other option, which we'll examine first, focuses on immediately addressing the issue of the light-squared bishop. Since the e6 pawn blocks the bishop, a natural move is b6. Black's idea is to fianchetto the bishop on the long diagonal with bishop b7, supporting the center. The other main point behind b6 is to prepare the important central counterstrike, c5. In order to understand the basic ideas for both sides, let's take a look at a grandmaster game in which both players continue to focus on sensible development while fighting for the center. Grandmaster Wang Yue, with the white pieces, played the natural developing move bishop d3, developing the bishop to a natural diagonal and pointing toward Black's king side. Sometimes Black decides to play d takes c4, giving up the central stronghold to open up the long diagonal and create active piece play with bishop b7. By capturing on c4, this also allows White active chances with a space advantage in the center, so it is not without some risk. Grandmaster Michael Adams, playing Black, continued with a classical developing move, bishop b7, developing the bishop and reinforcing the center. After White castled, Black develops the last minor piece with knight b to d7, supporting the knight on f6, and also preparing the thematic pawn break, c5. White centralized the queen with the natural queen e2, supporting the center and connecting the rooks on the back rank. Notice that Black will not have an easy time accomplishing the same thing, as Black's queen does not have a useful square to use. Grandmaster Adams solves this problem after first striking in the center with c5, adding pressure against White's d4 pawn. White maintained the tension in the center and continued to develop with rook f to d1, centralizing the rook and lining up with Black's queen on the same file. This is not a good sign for Black, especially if the center opens up. Grandmaster Adams played the instructive move, knight e4, centralizing the knight, which is well supported by the pawn on d5, as well as the light-squared bishop. Notice by moving the knight, it reveals the tension between the dark-squared bishops, offering a trade of minor pieces. White cannot easily avoid this trade, as bishop g3 allows knight takes g3, when Black gains the bishop pair in a comfortable position. Since White does not have any attractive alternatives, the most natural continuation is bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. After trading the dark-squared bishops, Black's queen has found a useful square, connecting the rooks on the back rank. We have seen the tension continue to build in the center, and White finally releases some of the tension with c takes d5. This capture helps open up the c-file, as well as increasing the scope of White's light-squared bishop on the queen side. Black regains central control with e takes d5, when White completed development with rook a to c1. White's rooks enjoy active files in the center, and as we'll soon see, White is prepared to change the central pawn structure with d takes c5. If Black wants to avoid this pawn structure, then Black can consider playing knight takes c3. With the idea of resolving the central tension after rook takes c3 and c4. Black gains a tempo against the light-squared bishop and prepares to expand on the queen side with b5, when Black enjoys a solid position. Instead of avoiding d takes c5, Grandmaster Adams continues to develop with rook a to c8, supporting the center and allowing White to transform the pawn structure with d takes c5. White opens the D and C files to increase the strength of his rooks, and prepares to fight against black's hanging pawns after b takes c5. The point is, if black recaptures c5 with a knight, this isolates the pawn on d5, which can become a potential target, and it also creates a hole on d4, which is an excellent post for white's knight. This is why Grandmaster Adams demonstrates a key theme on the black side of the Queen's Gambit decline, accepting hanging pawns with b takes c5. The d5 and c5 pawns are considered hanging pawns, as they are neighboring pawns on the same rank, isolated from the rest of the pawn structure. The hanging pawns must be protected by pieces, so they are natural targets for white to pressure. That being said, the hanging pawns control important squares in white's territory, and when properly timed, black can advance these pawns with c4, fixing the b2 pawn, which black may target on the b file, at the expense of weakening the d4 square. Or black may possibly advance the d pawn with d4, creating double-edged positions. In the game, Grandmaster Adams was able to outplay his opponent and won a nice game. Instead of playing bishop d3, white can resolve the tension in the center immediately with c takes d5. Since black is willing to activate the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal with bishop b7, white would like to fix a pawn on d5 in order to restrict black's bishop. By playing b6, the c6 square is a potential weakness, so white is trying to open up the c file to prepare rook c1, and possibly knight e5, adding pressure against black's queenside. Although e takes d5 is certainly possible, a more popular option is to play knight takes d5. Capturing with the knight encourages a trade of dark squared bishops, and at least temporarily keeps the long light squared diagonal clear of black pawns. This is relevant if white tries to avoid a trade of bishops with bishop g3, which then allows bishop b7, supporting the d5 knight and preparing the thematic pawn break c5. Since this does not promise white anything special, white typically agrees to the exchange of dark squared bishops with bishop takes e7. So after queen takes e7, white can play knight takes d5, forcing e takes d5, fixing a pawn on the d5 square, making bishop b7 less attractive. White can play bishop d3, although after the typical c5, white will have to consider black's possible option of playing c4, gaining a tempo against the light-squared bishop and taking space on the queen side. Another idea is to play the more modest-looking bishop e2. Instead of playing bishop b7, when black's bishop is somewhat passively placed behind the blocked d5 pawn, a stronger idea is to centralize this piece with bishop e6. It may seem strange to play b6 without playing bishop b7, but black's bishop is better placed supporting the center and eyeing the king side from the e6 square. b6 was not a waste of time, because it has another important idea in mind, to support the c5 pawn break. So after white castles, black can strike in the center with c5, when black enjoys reasonable chances in this solid position. An interesting twist on the idea of playing c takes d5 is to first play bishop e2, developing the bishop and waiting for black to play bishop b7. Now that the bishop is committed to the long diagonal, white can play bishop takes f6, eliminating the knight's protection of the d5 pawn. So after bishop takes f6, c takes d5. Unless black is willing to weaken the light squares with bishop takes d5, allowing knight takes d5, a positional decision black prefers to avoid, then white succeeds in restricting black's light-squared bishop after e takes d5, fixing the pawn on d5 and limiting the scope of the light-squared bishop. White can continue flexibly by castling, but white also has the option to try and discourage the c5 pawn break by playing b4, grabbing space on the queen side and clamping down on the c5 square. Black can decide to support the center and play solidly with c6, when black may later try to strike against the b4 pawn with a5. Future world champion Magnuscarlsen, when playing black against the world champion at that time, Vishwanathan Anand, demonstrates that black can continue to play actively with the thematic pawn break, c5. When after b takes c5, b takes c5, we see the familiar d5 c5 pawn structure in the center for black. Notice that black's dark squared bishop pins the d4 pawn to white's knight, so d takes c5 is not an option. Although black's pawn structure is less stable in the center, notice the light squared bishop serves an important role in protecting the d5 pawn, which allows black to play so actively in the center. In the game, black was able to hold the balance, and the game was eventually drawn. Instead of continuing to build the tension by playing the Tartikover with b6, another popular option is to clarify the position immediately with knight e4, turning the game into the Lasker defense. Since white enjoys more space and pressure against black's center, black's idea is to trade the dark squared bishops in a pair of knights to remove the tension against black's position. If white tries to avoid the exchange of dark squared bishops with bishop g3, white invites black to play knight takes g3, opening up the h-file after h takes g3, revealing the rook's pressure against h6, which may later support a kingside attack. Although black shouldn't fear this line, there is no rush to make this exchange, and not only can black strike in the center with c5, it's important to remember that the dark squared bishop moved to e7 to help defend against a pin, so this bishop can become incredibly active with bishop b4, pinning the knight on c3 and threatening to win material with knight takes c3. After bishop b4, black can also prepare c5, applying serious pressure against white's center. Since playing bishop g3 allows black good counterplay, white typically exchanges bishops with bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. When you see the Lasker defense for the first time, you may wonder what happens if white simply captures the knight with knight takes e4, d takes e4, doubling the pawns, and then attacking the e4 pawn with knight d2. This is not a promising line for white, as black can play f5, supporting the advanced pawn on e4 with a timely e5 pawn break to follow. Since capturing black's knight is not a great idea for white, white usually supports the knight with queen c2, or plays the most popular continuation, rook c1, supporting the knight, so if black plays knight takes c3, then white can maintain a healthy pawn structure with rook takes c3. The rook on c1 also x-rays black's pawn on c7, which is a tactical signal to keep in mind. The queenside knight can prove quite useful on the d7 square, helping support the center. But if black plays knight d7 immediately, this loses a pawn after c takes d5. Since e takes d5 allows knight takes d5, winning a pawn, black can try to play knight takes c3, but after rook takes c3, e takes d5, white wins a pawn with rook takes c7. Notice that black cannot regain the pawn with queen b4 check, attacking the king and b2 pawn, as white can play queen d2, defending against both of black's threats when white is simply up a pawn. Since knight d7 isn't possible just yet, black should support the center with c6. Now that the c-pawn is secured on c6, black can prepare knight d7. White typically continues to develop and adds pressure against black's annoying knight on e4 with bishop d3. Now that the knight is under serious pressure, black can trade knights with knight takes c3, when white typically responds with rook takes c3. By exchanging knights, Black is now ready to play the instructive idea, d takes c4, gaining a tempo against the bishop. By removing the pawn on d5, Black can focus on a future pawn break such as e5 or c5 without worrying about White playing c takes d5, saddling Black with an isolated d-pawn. This capture also clears a pawn from the long light squared diagonal, which will prove useful if Black prepares to fianchetto the bishop with b6 and bishop b7, followed by opening the diagonal with c5. After White captures the pawn with bishop takes c4, Black continues to develop and supports the center with knight d7. In response, White typically castles the king. Black now has to decide how to counterattack in the center. One idea is to create a pawn break immediately with e5, when Black will have to decide how to complete development and bring the light squared bishop and rook on a8 into the game. Another idea is to prepare a c5 pawn break with b6. Just like in the Tartikover, Black is preparing to fianchetto the light squared bishop and will focus on achieving the c5 pawn break. A typical response for White is to play bishop d3, revealing the rook's pressure against the c6 pawn. It's important to pay attention to the move order in this position. If Black first plays bishop b7, White is able to exploit Black's move order with bishop e4, pinning the c6 pawn to the bishop when White is ready to overwhelm Black's defenses of the c6 pawn with queen c2. Instead of bishop b7, Black should strike in the center immediately with c5. Black is now ready to solve the problem of the light squared bishop with bishop b7, so White can play the disruptive bishop e4, taking over the long diagonal and attacking the rook on a8. After rook b8, not only can Black consider playing bishop a6, a sensible plan is knight f6, attacking the light squared bishop, followed by completing development with bishop b7. In one high-level encounter, Grandmaster Peter Svidler tried to continue to restrict Black's light squared bishop with queen a4, adding pressure against Black's queenside and preparing to double rooks on the c-file. His opponent, Grandmaster Fabiano Caruana, played the instructive counterattack, knight f6, attacking the bishop and revealing the queen's protection of the a7 pawn. White continued with his plan of restricting Black on the light squares with bishop c6. But now that the bishop is blocking the c6 square, Black was able to activate the light squared bishop with the thematic plan, c takes d4. If White accepts an isolated queen's pawn with e takes d4, restricting Black's e5 pawn break, then Black can play a5, grabbing space and protecting the a-pawn, so Black can then play bishop b7 with a comfortable game. In the game, Svidler played knight takes d4. And since White's bishop prevents the idea of forking Black's queen and rook with knight c6, Black was able to activate his position with e5, attacking White's knight on d4 and liberating the light squared bishop, which can develop actively with bishop g4. As is typical in the Lasker, with careful play, Black has achieved a solid position, and the game was eventually drawn. Since the mainline variations of the Lasker have such a solid reputation, White can try to challenge Black's defenses with the more aggressive and double-edged idea of attacking on the king side immediately, either with g4 or h4, taking space on the king side and preparing a quick king side attack with g4 and g5. Against an unprepared opponent, this can be a deadly attacking line. One reasonable way for Black to respond is by continuing to develop with knight d7, remaining flexible and possibly preparing a central pawn break in the future. After White continues with g4. When your opponent plays a flank attack, it can be useful to counterattack in the center. That being said, Black hasn't had great success with an immediate e5, But one interesting plan is to play the typical Lasker exchange. Knight takes c3, rook takes c3. Now that there is less pressure against the d5 pawn, if black wants to provoke complications, then the pawn breaks e5 or c5 are interesting options to consider. On the other hand, if black would prefer to remain solid and try to neutralize white's kingside attack, a reasonable option is to play g6. When you are faced with a kingside attack, it's typically not a good idea to create more weaknesses by moving pawns on that side of the board. But g6 prepares to deal with h5 by playing g5, and if white plays g5, then black can close the kingside with h5. White's kingside attack suddenly looks less intimidating, and black has created a reasonably solid position. Just like in other lines of the Lasker, black still needs to figure out how to complete development and activate the light-squared bishop. One idea is to play rook d8, preparing to open the d-file with d takes c4, followed by playing the central pawn break e5. Black can also consider finding a proper move order to play b6, and develop the bishop on the long diagonal with bishop b7. White, on the other hand, still has a king in the center, and although black cannot directly exploit this fact, white still has to decide how to complete development as well. White's queen may create a queen-rook battery on the c-file with queen c2, or possibly add more pressure against black's center and kingside with queen b3. White's bishop may decide to develop to g2, adding pressure down the long light-squared diagonal. If white commits to an early kingside flank attack against the Lasker, both sides can expect interesting positions with plenty of scope for creative play. The Queen's Gambit declined is one of black's most reliable defenses against the Queen's Gambit. When white plays the classical bishop g5, both the Lasker and Tartikover defenses are considered rock-solid responses. It's no surprise that this opening has been employed by top grandmasters for over a century, and it's been featured in numerous World Championship matches. If you decide to play either side of the Queen's Gambit declined, you can know that you're in good company. If your main objective is to achieve solid, positionally sound play against the Queen's Gambit, then the Queen's Gambit decline may become a friend for a lifetime.